Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to ESSEC Asia Pacific for this panel discussion, co-organized with the EU Center in Singapore on the theme Winning Hearts and Minds, the Role of Culture in International Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome first our Dean, Professor Jean-Michel Blanquer, Dean of ESSEC Business School, for the welcome address. Thank you.
This topic is a topic that is very important for us. The role of culture in international relations is very linked to what's going on in this campus, in our institution in general. Culture nowadays is very important for the society, it is very important for the economy, it is very important for the international relations. It is important for the society because, of course, there is no society without culture. We all know that this word of culture means a lot of things, and we can put a lot of signification in culture. But one of the things we can be sure about is the fact that culture is not something which is fixed. Culture is a living thing, a systematic thing which suppose interactions and interactions in the society. That's why, in the context of the globalization, culture is something that is evolving a lot, with a great impact on our society due to migrations, due to communication, due to the evolution of democracy. This fact, of course, is very important even for the future professional life of our students, and we acknowledge also that the evolution of culture has an impact on the economy. If I take only one example, we spoke just before with our guest about the question of luxury. The question of luxury is a typical illustration of the impact of culture on the economy, because if you want to build a brand in luxury, and your brand in general, of course, you have to have roots, you have to understand the link between culture and action, between the culture and the image, between the question of the content and the question of the perception by the others. This deep link between culture and economy is also, of course, something that we have to think about when we speak about international relations, because, of course, this factor, the question of the roots, the way we deal with that, the way we think about the content of culture in the 21st century has a great impact. And of course, culture has an impact on international relations. It's obvious. We all know now the word soft power invented by Joseph Nye at the beginning of the 90s, but in reality, soft power exists since the existence of the human being. And the big empires know that you can't win only by military force, you win by hearts and minds. And this is the question is that in the context of globalization, we are in a new situation to analyze and to act with new concepts about the role of culture in international relations. Today, what we have to deal with is the question of standardization, and as a business school, we have a special responsibility for that, because we all know that if at the end of this century we are just a globalized world with the same culture, it's not a target in itself, it's not aim for the human being. We need diversity of minds, diversity of thinking, diversity of cultures. And if we want to preserve the diversity of culture, it's as important as preserve the biodiversity. And that's why we think that as a business school we have to develop diversity of perceptions. That's why we have an international faculty, that's why we have a lot of international students, and that's why we try to have campuses in different parts of the world, like here in Singapore, or in the future in Africa and in Latin America, just to respect the diversity of the world, to exchange between different cultures, and to be able to create not the culture of the future, but the cultures of the future. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your insights about such an important topic. And we are very happy to hear you now. Thank you very much.
First of all, of course, allow me to express my appreciation to the ESSEC Business School for hosting us here. And of course, my heartfelt thanks to your group and your staff, the marketing team and the communications team for helping us organize this panel, this discussion today. The EU Center and ESSEC Business School has actually worked with each other for a number of times now. We have been able to bring together distinguished speakers to share with us perspectives and insights into a number of interesting and timely issues, from Greece and the Eurozone debt crisis to the EU's international ambitions and the geopolitics of proximity, and also EU's trade strategy and economic partnership between Asia and Europe. Today's panel discussion on the role of culture in international relations and how to win hearts and minds, I think could not be more timely as the world we are living in now become much more interconnected and globalized, but at the same time also much more fragmented as issues of identity, values and culture become much more salient and much more contested. So we are really honored and privileged to have with us today as moderator, Ambassador Tommy Koh, one of Singapore's most distinguished and accomplished diplomat and negotiator. So he's going to help us moderate today's panel discussion with Ambassador Michael Reiterer, Principal Advisor at the Asia Pacific Department of the European External Action Service, and who has served the EU in many distinguished capacities for almost 20 years now. And of course, ESSEC's very own distinguished professor, Professor Chenomi Nasarovic, who taught geopolitics and international marketing in ESSEC for more than 15 years. So without much ado, I would like to invite Ambassador Tommy Koh to begin today's discussion.
I want to begin with a few words about the topic. Michael gave Dr. Yeo and me choice of several topics, and Dr. Yeo and I both chose this topic because we think the topic is important. It opens up a new field of inquiry. Political scientists tend to have great respect for hard power and very little respect for so-called soft power. So to political scientists, power means military power, economic power. And some of the hardline political scientists will even say there's no such thing as soft power. But it is not true. If the object of diplomacy is to win the hearts and minds of other people you relate to, then obviously soft power is important. I wouldn't say it's more important or less, it is important. And I want to begin by sharing with you a few comments about culture in Singapore diplomacy. My wife has always told me not to make more than 3 points, so I'll just make 3 points. Point number one, in the past 50 years, I've undertaken a lot of negotiations on behalf of Singapore, on behalf of the UN. And before I begin a negotiation with another country or group of countries, I always take the time to study the history and culture of the other country. And why do I do this? I do this because I believe that all of us grow up in our own cultural box. The way we think, the way we look at the world, our choice of language, our negotiating styles are shaped to some extent by the history and culture of our respective countries. So before I negotiate with India or China or the United States or Indonesia or Malaysia, I try to understand the history and culture of that country. My second point, I'm very lucky in that in addition to having a diplomatic hat, I've also had cultural hats. I was the first chairman of the Arts Council, and I was the second chairman of the National Heritage Board. And I try to use diplomacy as an instrument of Singapore diplomacy. So let me give you a few examples. Many years ago, when the President of Poland was going to visit Singapore, and the Prime Minister of Singapore asked a group of us, what can we do for the President of Poland? He said, we have relatively few contact with Poland. There are not many contact points. Is there anything memorable we can do for the President of Poland? And some of us did some research and said, yes, a son of Poland, Joseph Conrad, who's normally referred to as a British writer, was actually born a Pole. His father was a Polish nationalist and was sent into exile by Russia. And Joseph Konrad Konelski was born in exile. His parents perished during exile, and he grew up with his uncle in Marseille. For some reason, when he was a young man, he decided to leave France and to make his future in England as a British merchant seaman. And during the first 5 years of his seafaring life, Singapore was his headquarters. And he would use Singapore as headquarters and sail all over the Indonesian, Malaysian archipelago. And if you read his novels and short stories, many of them were inspired by real people he met or stories he heard. So we proposed to my Prime Minister and to the Embassy of Poland whether we could put up a marker to commemorate Joseph Conrad, and whether the Polish president would do us the honor of unveiling it. And they said, yes, we regard Joseph Conrad as a son of Poland. And the next time you visit the Fullerton Hotel, please have a look at the marker outside the Fullerton Hotel facing the Singapore River. This was the marker we put up, and it was a great success. Every Polish leader that visits Singapore would put flowers at this marker. And so when this became successful, it inspired me to continue to do more, to mark the visits to Singapore of great men and great leaders who had visited Singapore in their lifetimes. And so the second marker I put up was to honor Ho Chi Minh, who had visited Singapore twice in his lifetime. And this has become very, very popular with Vietnamese leaders who always also visit the plot in front of the Asian Civilization Museum and put flowers there. And after Ho Chi Minh, I put out a marker for Jose Rizal, the national hero of the Philippines, who was executed by Spain when he was only 35 years old. But in that short life, in my research, I found that he had visited Singapore 5 times. So we put out a marker to honor Jose Rizal. And on his birthday, every day, a group of Filipinos would gather around his marker to commemorate his birthday. And after Jose Rizal, I put up a marker to honor the Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru, who had also visited Singapore several times during his life and is much admired here. And finally, in November 2007, put out a marker to honor the great Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. And it was unveiled by the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the current President of China, Xi Jinping. So these little gestures, connect Singapore to these great countries, and you touch the hearts of these people. So it's an example of cultural diplomacy, of using culture as an instrument of diplomacy. The other thing I did when I was chairman of the Heritage Board was that every year I would organize across all our museums a festival to celebrate the history, heritage, and culture of an ASEAN country, beginning with Vietnam, then Philippines, then Thailand, then Indonesia, and so on. And this again touches the hearts of our partners in ASEAN. So these are just 3 examples of how a very small country has tried to use history, heritage, and culture as instruments of diplomacy. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Michael to share with us his wise words.
I think talking about culture and international relations has become more important in recent times. We are talking whether a new order is coming, whether the existing order is at least discussed or under threat. We are talking more and more about the importance of belief, the importance of culture comes back perhaps through the back door. I think it is important to have in mind that cultures are, and the word was already used, diverse. And diversity is, I think, a conditio sine qua non. Without diversity, there cannot be cultures. And I think that that is something which is essential, it's important, and I think it is especially important when talking about the European Union. So, I have put up just this quote, so that you can read it, because I think what is important is that this is a statement which comes from the European Parliament, from the representatives of the European peoples, directly elected for since 1978. And I think it gives a good message about the importance of culture, not only in international relations, but also in the living together of Europe. And that's something which we have to remember very much these days, when we do have some problems in the near abroad. So these European values and the cultural diversity, how you make use of it, this is politics, international politics and cultural politics, and I will come to that. I think what is also interesting is that the European Union has as a vocation to make sure that these elements are also part of its foreign policy. That's rather unique, because whenever you look into treaties or constitutions, you would hardly find any rules how your diplomacy should be executed. Because normally diplomacy, this is something which has the reputation to be for professionals. There is a sort of secrecy, and therefore this new approach, I think, is important. And to write it into a treaty means that you have to follow it. I think it also has the advantage that it is meant to prevent that you have a double standard, that you have a different foreign policy from your own principles, how you organize your house. This is, of course, a challenge. There's always national interest, so we have to find out what is European interest and how can you marry it with values. I'm not saying this is working all the time, but I think if you have it as a goal, you have to orient your policy and your policy making according to these standards. You can see this as a recurrent theme, and that's perhaps a little bit the European approach. As you know, we always like institutions, we like treaties, and that's already something which we have to be aware, because it's not the Asian approach. The Asian approach is not the legalistic one, it's more the informal approach. And as Tommy was saying, if you are not only negotiating but interacting, you have to put yourself into the mind of your partner. So there is no point on insisting on something where you know you will not achieve it because it is not part of culture. And culture has also an importance in international relations, because everybody who is acting as a foreign policy maker brings his or her own mental framework to the table. And I was very pleased when you said that you are reading novels. That's exactly what I did before going to Japan. I bought 10 novels and was reading them because I thought this is much more interesting than the briefings which I had to digest anyhow. So, therefore I was also pleased when I read the book which Levi co-authored or edited about the 50 years of relationship between Singapore and the European Union. I would say about 1/3 of the articles are about the cultural relationship between the European Union and Singapore. I have also read with some interest that Ambassador Burlich in his contribution found out that the Paris cinematograph was set up here in 1904 in Victoria Street. So we have a long-standing tradition of European film festivals. That's quite outstanding. Now, I think when we have to think in terms of cultural diplomacy, I will not now lecture in a perhaps Titanic approach as you meant, what is all meant by these different forms of diplomacy. But I think these are the basic elements which you can use in cultural diplomacy. One of the most important ones is probably this people-to-people dimension, which I put here first. Trying to get people together between Asia and Europe sounds like something which cannot work. How can you bring billions of people together? So the only way that you can achieve that is that you slice the cake and that you work with influential decision makers which have the possibility to transmit. But you also have to know that these messages which come from leaders have to fall on a fertile ground. And preparing that fertile ground, I think this is very much the people-to-people dimension. And there, I must say, and as Tommy has mentioned, I started out my career as ASEM counselor in 1998 to 2002, when I had the privilege to work with Tommy Coe again, that the Asia-Europe meeting had as its only institution, the institution which is dealing with culture and with people-to-people. And I think this is significant, and I think it's also something which is different from the approach if I look at APEC, for example. APEC is set up as a conference between economies, as it is already meant. So having made a conscious decision to include culture in the Asia-Europe dimension and to have it as a political, economic, and cultural pillar, I think showed in 1996 that this is a major, different understanding and different approach to the relationship. 1996, and ASEM will have its 20th anniversary this year in Ulaanbaatar, started out because there was the feeling there's something missing, this famous missing link between Europe and Asia, whereas there were the links between Asia, the United States, and the US and Asia. So bringing this to the table, I think was a major achievement in the Asia-Europe relationship, and I think we should not forget that and should build on it. The other elements, I will not go into any details, but what is perhaps also important just to mention the educational and science diplomacy, speaking at the university, but it is not only about scholarships. I think it's also about providing the possibility to have this joint experience of learning. Because what is the best recipe against intolerance is to get to know the others in working and in learning together. I have done quite a few postdoctoral studies, and if I look back to the relationships which I established in the 3 years after my studies in Austria, that's enriching, and these are contexts which work. So if I need some advice, I know where to turn, and this is an international network, and this international network I think we should all cherish. There is, of course, always a danger of misunderstanding. The dangers of misunderstandings are when you think that you are special, that your culture is the only culture, and that you have found the wisdom. However, there is a natural inclination to do that, because everybody has been brought up in your own culture. And it needs a special effort to take that step to get to know another culture. And there is, I think, the famous saying, you cannot understand your own culture if you don't know other cultures. And there is also the problem that if you have your own culture, that you might have an inclination to defend it as a sort of reflex. And if that is supported by a rather nationalistic politics, then you can get into a very dangerous politics, especially international politics. And therefore I'm convinced that those who have to do international politics, they have to have courses, they have to have understanding of culture and international relations, because I think that can help you to fall into traps, not because you are a bad person, but because you don't have the reflex to think differently and to open up. So I think cultural diplomacy has to be an open process. And in contrary to the traditional diplomacy, it's not only about the official sector, it's not only diplomats, it's not only the official institutions. It is very much the private sector, the cultural operators, artists, foundations, companies, creative industries, funds, orchestras, private cultural institutions. And they bring a new modus operandi, a new way of doing diplomacy. Because if you speak and work with cultural industry, with artists, they don't want to be told what they have to do. They don't want to be told what they have to think. But they would like to work, it is called at arm's length. They are not unhappy if they get some support, but they don't want to be conditioned. And culture has by definition an element of openness. And I think that has a repercussion also on the way you do diplomacy. So it's not the diplomacy in the back room, the famous smoking rooms which don't exist anymore because luckily we have strong regulations. So it's a different art of doing diplomacy, and I think this is something which is unfortunately not in everybody's head yet, and I think we still have to work on it. Joseph Nye, who was mentioned, soft power, he has said that cultural diplomacy provides actually the framework in which soft policy can work. And it is also quite different from communication, different from information, because it has to be communication, a two-way process. And also very important to have credibility. The state with the best story wins, and the best propaganda is no propaganda. And what he was also saying very clearly, don't step on on your own message. If you say A and you do B, you lose your credibility. That's also in foreign policy, especially if you create a red line publicly, you better stick to the red line, otherwise you're losing credibility. So cultural diplomacy is not only about projecting one's image abroad, but rather about building bridges between different cultures. I think this is probably always the best image, is building bridges between cultures. And I think also what cultural diplomacy should bring is how to learn to listen. How do I get the message? Because only if I know how I get the message, I can pass the message. So it is important not only what you say, but also what you hear. Otherwise, it will not work. So this cultural relations, and I think that's something, a quote which I found in the brochure of the British Council. Cultural relations are increasingly conceived not as a power, but as a space of mutual activity, doing something together, learning together, where receiving the culture of others is as important as showing one's own culture to the rest of the world. A world in which listening is at least as important as talking. We have seen that in culture, in diplomacy very often. Let me give an example, I think, which has shown how important it is to have this cultural approach. I think one of the main reasons why the Copenhagen Summit on climate change did not work was but because the European Union, which was the driving force, which brought this issue to the fore, went into this conference that we must have a binding agreement, and everything less is a disaster. Well, unfortunately, everybody knew that, and there were quite many who knew that we want to do everything, but we don't want a binding agreement. And if you go into such a situation, you create no good results. And I think that was a lesson learned, and Paris, a few months ago, was more successful because it was a more open, inclusive approach. And I think that's exactly what foreign policy, which is influenced by cultural understanding, is all about. And cultural diplomacy has to help to create a forum, a framework that you can learn, that you can understand and bring it to the negotiating table. Because what is important is, it is cultural understanding. I think it is as much important to know where you agree as you also know where you disagree. And we have to appreciate the difference. Only if you accept a difference, then you are able to maintain an open discussion. I cannot be self-righteous all the way, otherwise it will not work. So what we have to achieve is that we get to a dialogue of cultures through a culture of dialogue. And I think this is the prime objective of cultural diplomacy. And this cultural diplomacy, just to link it back with educational policies, has to start here where we are at universities to bring this understanding not only into the official policy making, but also into the relationships of companies, of enterprises, of foundations, because cultural diplomacy is not diplomacy between states, it is an open one. It should be this people-to-people dimension. Thank you.
I was born in a country which used to be the example of the dialogue between cultures because this country used to be called Yugoslavia, and up to the 90s, this was considered to be the model for many countries in the world, and we frequently have visits from Asia, especially from India and from Indonesia, in order to see what is going on there. Sadly, this country, after the 90s, is also the symbol of war and the symbol of intolerance. So it means that the very same country used to be very positively associated concerning the dialogue of cultures, and in a couple of years, it shifted to something that many people considered should be cultures which cannot be conciliated, meaning the differences in culture are so big that these people cannot live together. So, same country, in a couple of years, passing from the bright situation to a very dark situation after that. So, a few words about Michael mentioned before. So, especially the position of the European Union is a very interesting one. So, I will refer to what John Kerry indicated some days ago when he said that the immigrant crisis in Europe is an existential problem. What does it mean, existential? It means that Europe can disappear because of that. So the question is, how come that 2-3 million new immigrants can put in danger a construction where we have more than 350 million people? How is it possible? Would just 2-3 million people invade the European Union, that they will take power in the European Union, or what is going on? So probably he was thinking that the culture of the people coming to Europe are totally incompatible with the cultures that we have within Europe. So this is the starting debate. Of course, they are very hard words, but this is how some people view the situation. So it will be useless to have a policy without talking about the real problems that we can have there. Among the problems that I noted during the presentation of Michael here, I noted two elements, that is the human rights on one side and democracy on the other side. And everyone will agree that these two elements are the basis of the European Union, and very probably that they are the results of a very strong cultural heritage, going back to Greece, continuing with Rome, and continuing afterwards with the Enlightenment period, Renaissance, and so on. So in that case, we have one cultural makeup, and there's human rights and democracy don't come out of the blue. There was a very big history coming to the situation that we have today. But I also agree with what Michael mentioned, that the culture of dialogue is a necessity. So I will take the opposite point of view now. There are two elements which are happening here. If let's say in one European country, the majority of the population through democratic votes don't want immigrants, what should we do? Should we respect democratic will of these people, or should we say that they are wrong? And in that case, we will impose them a certain number of immigrants coming to these countries. So this is one problem that we have about democracy, because democracy can be extremely positive, but it can be also extremely negative. And we have many dictators in the past who came to power through democracy, that is, through a democratic vote. So if democracy is the basis of the European Union, the question is there something which can limit this democracy or not? And another point concerning the dialogue of cultures is that when we also talk about the immigrant populations coming to Europe, of course, from the European Union, the starting point is I want to understand the cultures of these people coming to Europe in order to give them the best acceptance, in order to give them the best conditions of accommodation within Europe. But the question is, do these people coming to Europe also want to understand what is happening in the European Union? And do they accept the values of the European Union? Because it is a two-way approach. It is not one way. It must work both ways. So we have here a certain number of, let's say, delicate questions. I'm coming from France, and you know that France is firmly standing on the point not to accept many immigrants coming to France. And the nearby country, Germany, is accepting. So these two countries are the engine of the European Union. And they have definitely different positions concerning this very point. So the question is the cultural proximity between France and Germany bigger than the peace agreement that they have on the immigrant crisis? If it is bigger than the problem that we have about immigrant crisis, in that case they will find a way how to solve it. But if the immigrant crisis is bigger than the proximity or we have this close relationship concerning all the different values that we have in Europe, in that case it will be very hard to do so. So I voluntarily used some dark approach in order to launch the discussion, because this panel discussion is not only between us, it is also with you. So we would like you very much to participate and giving back word to Professor Cohen in order to initiate this kind of debate.
The first question is what he calls a dichotomy between human rights and democracy. Some member states of the European Union do not wish to accept more refugees. And they are democratically elected governments. So Siromia's question is, does the European Union have a right to impose refugees on countries like Poland or Hungary, for example, with democratically elected government that do not wish to accept more refugees? So that's one question. His second question, I think, is a more profound question. A European leader recently said the refugee crisis poses a transcendental threat to Europe. And Siromia's question is, isn't it a ridiculous statement? Can 2-3 million refugees pose a transcendental threat to the European integration project? So how do you explain it? Is there a discomfort on the part of Europeans about the incoming refugees because they're Muslims? Is there a discomfort between Christian Europe and the refugees coming from North Africa who are Muslims? Is there a feeling that unlike other refugees, these Muslims do not necessarily accept European culture and European values and will not assimilate, and that they may behave differently from Europeans in, for example, the attitude toward women that we saw in Cologne and elsewhere? So two questions.
Well, thank you very much for these easy questions. Well, let me first start with democracy. I think, Sedome, you pointed out one of the dangers which is inherent in democracy. If democracy is not deeply rooted in a society, then it might be difficult to maintain it if it is, if I may say so, attacked by its own means. I think we have quite a few examples. Remember the Weimar Republic. A democratic process brought the Nationalsozialismus to power. It was a democratic process. We had elections in Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections. We had earlier on elections in Palestine, and Hamas came out. So can I say now, well, sorry guys, that was not what we wanted,
try again. Well, I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Because in order that democracy can work, the inherent rules of democracy have to be respected. If I use power which I got in the democratic process to abolish democracy, then I think it is against the rule of the game, because you were not elected to abolish democracy in a democratic process. So if you reduce democracy to one single issue, elections, and you manage somehow to have elections which you can say, well, they were more or less fair, then I think it is one important element of democracy, but it's not enough to make democracy sustainable and work. So democracy and implanting somewhere democracy, I think, is a long process. It's a learning process where we have also to accept. And I think what we are seeing right now, and I hope it will continue like this, is the process we see in Myanmar. I think that is a rather positive
No, sorry,
process.
don't talk about Myanmar. You're not answering this question about Poland and Hungary.
Poland and Hungary.
No, I want to interrupt you. I want to say that your dichotomy is a false dichotomy. It is not a dichotomy between human rights and democracy. Poland, Hungary, and all the other member states of the European Union have every right to elect a government of their choice. But this democratically elected government must conform to the European Union's collective decisions. Just because they are elected by the people doesn't give them a right to say, I don't accept the rules of the family, you know? So to me, the dichotomy you pose is a false dichotomy. It is not a dichotomy between democracy on the one hand and human rights on the other hand. It is the dichotomy between a member state that's obliged to follow the rules and a member state refusing to follow the rules.
Can I answer
Yeah,
this?
please.
Sorry for that. Do you hear me? Yes.
It's on.
I'm voluntarily taking the other side. It doesn't mean that I mean everything.
No, please.
So, I will answer to this. The refugee crisis is not a European right. It has not been, the European Union has not been created around refugees. So in that case, if one country says, we don't want refugees, it is the right of this country not to accept them. So, and I will finish with the example coming from Austria, when FPO has been elected. I remember this time when the European Commission was thinking about introducing sanctions against Austria because they did not
But
respect the rules.
that's a different issue.
Well,
That's a different issue.
No.
I won't let you go.
Yes.
The refugee crisis was not foreseen either at the beginning of the European journey in Rome or subsequently in Maastricht and so on. But the point is this: faced with a collective challenge of huge numbers of refugees seeking refuge in Europe, the European Union collectively decided that the burden has to be shared by the member states, and they have allocated a certain quota to the different member states. It is a collective decision. As long as you stay in the European Union, you must comply with the collective decision. It doesn't give Poland or Hungary or any other state the right to say, I want to stay in the Union, but I will not comply with the collective decision. That's the issue.
Well, I was coming to that slowly.
No, don't talk about Myanmar and other issues.
No.
Digressing, you know.
It's-
And also the election of the extreme right to form the coalition government in Austria is a different issue. So let's not confuse the issue.
No,
It's a different issue.
I think what is the issue now with those countries who don't agree, within the democratic system, they have the possibility to go to court, to the European Court of Justice, and that's what they're trying to do. So I think we stay in the democratic system. It is one of these principles of solidarity which is at stake, and that's, I think, therefore you hear all these alarming signs because solidarity is one of the founding principles of the European Union, and therefore one has to pay attention to that. But when on your second question on the refugees, Tommy, you're right. Of course, this is a special situation. However, I think had it been managed from the beginning in line with the obligation each and every state, and all European states have signed up to the Geneva Convention of the Refugees, then we would not have had that problem. Because those who are refugees, they have a right to be received. And this is a clear-cut decision which has to be taken. Now, of course, you can argue there are so many people who want to have a better life, and they also would like to come, and it might be cruel to say, well, sorry guys, you are not threatened in your life, and therefore you cannot come. But I think this is, if we have such a policy which is not mixing everything, we would be much better off, and it is democratic and in line with the rule of law if you honor your international obligations. And that's perfectly possible. And I think what we have to do now in Europe, we have to get back a little bit to normal. Just saying, well, open borders everywhere, this does not work. But on the other hand, it's also quite interesting, and I always tell it a little bit positive, isn't that also a sort of compliment for Europe? Where are all these people going? They think there's a better life in Europe. They are not going to Saudi Arabia, they are not going to Kuwait, they are not coming in hordes, a little bit difficult geographically, to Asia. But just to give you one more example, Japan, which is far away, yes, but Japan accepted last year 22 refugees. Two.
Well, that's something. Can I just interrupt you? It is not true to say that. But first of all, under international law, it's very important for us to distinguish between refugees on the one hand and economic migrants on the other hand. Under international law, if a person is fleeing persecution or war or conflict, the person is regarded as a refugee. And all countries which are parties to the Refugee Convention, and I would argue even countries like Singapore, which are not parties to the Refugees Convention, are under an obligation under international law to respect the principle of non-refoulement, which is if a refugee comes to your shore, even without your consent or blessing, you cannot send this refugee back to the country from which he or she has fled. An economic migrant, on the other hand, has no such right. So one problem in Europe is to distinguish between refugees and economic migrants.
Perhaps one more issue to the Muslims, because you mentioned it.
I have to go away now. I've got a meeting at 5, so I'm going to ask the PO to take my place. But before I go away, I think, Lewy, you have to press these two gentlemen very hard on the issue. Since we are talking about cultural diplomacy, my sense is, before I go, I want to say, my sense is that there is a deficit of understanding. There's a deficit of understanding between Christian Europe and the Islamic civilization. And I think part of the discomfort in Europe is that the refugees are primarily Muslims. There's a fear that these Muslim refugees will not be able to assimilate to the European culture and European values. So that's my parting shot. So
I just that you hear before you run. I have checked the figures. In 2010, we had in Europe 44 million Muslims. That's 6% of the population, and of those, 19 million, 3.8% were living in the European Union. So it's not that there are no Muslims in Europe and suddenly there's an influx. And I mean, even if you go back to history, Cordoba, I mean, I
never said there are no Muslims living in Europe. There are Muslims which are citizens, of France or Belgium and various countries. But my overall view is that there's a deficit of trust and misunderstanding between Christian Europe and Islam. And also, many of the second generation Muslims who are born in Europe do not seem to have assimilated well, do not seem to feel that they are first-class citizens of their adopted home. And so you've seen problems in France, in Belgium, and elsewhere. You know? But I'm afraid I have to run away, so let me ask Levi to take my place.